washing in general. So just give it a second for the YouTube section to click into place. Just give it one more minute for people to log in. Those that are waiting until we start officially, I can highly recommend reading through Dr. Kolb's intro here at the start, where he talks a little bit about the issue of Yadayim. We are beginning a new Masechet, and as always, it's good to familiarize yourself with some of the general terms, and we will talk about that before we begin officially with the Mishnah. But he also gives some very interesting background information about this, and I will summarize it, but he goes into more detail than we might end up doing on our own. Just waiting to see if anyone else is adding to the login.
And Rabbi, how come this section wasn't covered with the laws of impurity? It gets its own section.
Well, yes, exactly. There is a lot going on, and as for those of you joining us through YouTube or late, I've already explained to Aaron that some of this we're going to have to talk about as we begin. So I'm asking him to hold on to his questions, and I'll hold on to my answers, because there are some general things that we need to discuss. Because Yadayim is about a lot more than just hands. It is very representative of much of Rabbinic Judaism. It helps us conceptualize bigger issues than just washing our hands before eating. There's a reason why I find it a fascinating Masechet, and one of the more accessible parts of Tohorot, of the Seder, the section of the Mishnah that deals with purity legislation. It's a little bit more accessible, I think, bite-size, and a concept that's more relatable, but deceptively relatable. And I think we've hit our usual time, so I'm just going to continue segueing into my intro here. I say deceptively familiar because the concept of netilat yadayim, of washing our hands before we eat from a lechem, a bread meal, a fixed meal, and there's much more halacha about that than we're going to cover in the Masechet together, is something that most of us who take our Jewish ritual seriously almost take for granted as being, well, obvious. That's what you do. Of course you do netilat yadayim before eating bread. I mean, it's one of the first things you learn either in school, if you are lucky enough to be exposed to it from a young age, or even earlier in your household, if you're lucky enough to be raised with this, or it's one of the first things you learn when you are a Baal Tshuva, somebody coming to Judaism and traditional practice when you are already an adult. Netilat yadayim, the washing of one's hands, is right up there with like, and this is the way you wear tefillin, and this is the way we daven. It's one of the introductory mitzvahs because we do it all the time. Maybe you don't eat bread as much. I know I don't eat bread that often outside of Shabbat, but the act of netilat yadayim is just ubiquitous. It happens very frequently in a normal life, at least daily from waking. But when it comes to mealtime, very often this is a part of how meals work. And as such, people are taught it very early. But with that introduction, we have to take the benefit of 2,000 years of practice. And as Dr. Kolb explains in his introduction, and as we will touch on multiple times throughout this Masechet, it's not a given that netilat yadayim as we know it would become the practice. Netilat yadayim, the hand washing that we'll discuss, is not explicitly stated deoraita in the Torah. In fact, it seems a little incongruous with the Torah. When we in Mishnah, or if you're joining me in my Torah classes from time to time, when we talk about tum'ah, about ritual impurity, and we talk about removing the ritual impurity, one of the first principles that is introduced is the fact that If part of you is ritually impure, all of you is ritually impure. If you touch a dead body with this hand, your other hand becomes ritually impure at the same time. It is, moves at the speed of light, if you will. There is no way to measure the speed. It's just instant. And that means that part of me, if I touch a sheretz, a creepy crawly that transmits impurity with my foot, then the top of my head and everything in between are also ritually impure. And yet here we have a mitzvah established by the Chachamim, by the sages, that says our hands can somehow have a ritual purity status different than the rest of our body. And like I say, that is just really quite at odds. If we want to normally purify ourselves, we go to a mikveh. There is a full body immersion, and then the body is ritually pure. And you can't just normally put a foot in and expect it to be ritually purified. That's not the way the mikveh works. Likewise, if one part of you remains ritually impure, such as like you keep your hand outside the mikveh as you go in, when you step out of the mikveh, you are ritually impure. This is why the immersion in the mikveh requires the whole body to go in all at once, all entirely, from toes to hair, everything at once. And yet Netilat Yadayim is set up as a practice where we seem to be treating the hands as almost as though they were a separate item from our body. And this is odd. Now, why is it like this? Well, I'm not going to go into all of the history of the practice and all of the hypotheses behind it, but I do want to share at least a few of the broader outlines that have been suggested both by tradition and by research. So by tradition, the idea is that this began as a legislation for truma, that for making sure the Kohanim who received truma, the special gift of food that was given by the regular rest of us, that they were going to take the purity regulation seriously as we were when we gave truma, that they would have this additional precaution of doing a ritual washing of their hands before eating the truma. As the temple fell into destruction at the hands of the Romans, this action was perpetuated to maintain the remembrance of the temple and the remembrance of the sacrifices. And at the same time, it also became even more widespread to do even if you're not a Kohen, and even if you're not eating truma. That as many other activities were also present after the temple or during the waning days of the temple, there was a democratization, a universality of these customs to try and put a little bit of the temple ritual into the hands, pardon the pun, of the entire community. And Netilat Yadayim became part of that. Similarly, there were many that wanted to accentuate the purity laws, especially at a time when the purity laws were not being widely observed, or they were being overly observed. One of the things we know from both rabbinic literature as well as other literature from the Second Temple period is that some people totally neglected all issues of ritual purity, that they would not be concerned with ritual purity at all, and this created a great barrier between them and other Jews. We also know that there were some groups, the Qumran cult, for example, as found possibly mentioned in Josephus as the Essenes, although that's debatable. But we certainly know that the group that stored the Dead Sea Scrolls and that built the different encampments in the Dead Sea area, they were obsessed with ritual purity. And they would visit the mikveh multiple times every day as individuals as well as community. That ritual purity for them was a huge matter, figuring even more prominently than it did in rabbinic literature. Ritual purity was a big deal, either for those who kept it or those who didn't. What we could see in Netilat Yadayim is a compromise position, that we are not going to require people to immerse constantly, But we are also not going to forget about ritual purity, but we are going to keep what could be called a zecher, a reminder of ritual purity concerns. And this is especially important once the temple is destroyed and ritual purity becomes less and less of a tangible issue, that it is not something that is going to affect our ability to go to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices or to partake of them, because none were being offered. And as ritual purity began to be less important, and as the rabbis came to the conclusion that all of the world was tameh, that the entire world and everything in it was ritually impure, there became a question of, well, why bother then? Why do we do anything with regards to ritual purity? Why have the mikvah? Why have any issue of ritual purity for the deceased? If we're all going to be tameh 24/7, it just seems like we should ignore it and call it a day. We're just impure, we're done. But luckily, most of what we do doesn't matter for impurity issues. So, in the end, it's not a big problem. Wait for the red heifer and then we'll reboot. The rabbis were, I believe, rightly concerned that if we waited for the red heifer to eventually come and the restoration of the temple, Yemei HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, that ritual purity would have dropped completely off the radar, and it would have been next to impossible to rekindle an understanding and appreciation for this aspect of Judaism. As such, Netilat Yadayim may have taken what was already an interesting focal point of Second Temple life and turned it into a very important reminder, memento, zecher, of the ritual practice, as such that we would be able to bear in mind the importance of ritual purity that would eventually become important, but could add a layer of sanctity even in our daily life that we would otherwise be without. So as much as Netilat Yadayim may seem logically incongruous with the overall teachings of full immersion for proper ritual purity, it really has served a critical role in transmitting. And I believe that was part of the intention. We will eventually see later on in this Masechet that the rabbis are quite willing to adjust the knobs of ritual purity issues in order to promote different behaviors. And I think Netilat Yadayim is that idea writ large, that they were willing to establish a particular custom in a particular way that was designed to create a certain set of behaviors, beliefs, and spiritual understanding. Now, research-wise, there's some very interesting discussion that the particular form of ritual washing that we have may have originated, or maybe originate is the wrong word, may have adopted, that's the better word, may have adopted certain practices from the Greco-Roman form of washing before eating, and then that was done. And the main evidence for this is the fact that we're talking about Netilat Yadayim, which if you are familiar with Hebrew or even just looked it up in the dictionary, you'll know that the word netilah doesn't mean washing. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with cleanliness. It's a very unusual word to come with the phrase yadayim for a washing ritual. The other place where we see the word netilah, where it is sort of more logical, is with the issue of lulav. Netilat lulav, when we lift the lulav, netilat generally means to elevate or to lift. That seems to make perfect sense. We are taking up the lulav. Netilat yadayim, okay, midrashically it's been taken to mean we lift our hands, and we'll talk about why we have the hands up when we do that as we go through the Masechet. But a much more simple explanation is that a natala is a Greek word for a hand-washing cup. That in the Greco-Roman world, they used a hand-washing cup that a servant would pour over your hands in order to prepare you for a meal. And that cup was called a natala. So did some brilliantly insightful rabbi of the ancient world say, hold on, we want to preserve ritual purity. We want to maintain this idea. We have the idea of water as being a source of ritual purity in Judaism because of the issue of mikveh. And here the Greco-Romans are also doing this. And some of their habits we've already adopted as we put together our Seder, which is very similar to their food symposia. So what if we also use this hand washing metaphor, this idea of pouring the water from this cup that they call natala? Why don't we use that as part of our continuation of adjusting how we handle purity issues for the purpose of maintaining more of an element of purity in our lives? And do we know that for a fact? No, we don't have a smoking gun that this is exactly what happened. But I would not be surprised if the rabbis drew from the vocabulary and practices around them to do something that would benefit the Jewish community in ways that were completely original and unintended by the original form that we're seeing, the original source that was drawn from. The same way that the Seder radically altered the Greco-Roman symposia and turned it into a spiritual event par excellence, so too, as well as Prus Bowl, and possibly even ketubot, the marriage contracts that were completely radically altered in ways that are inspired and have enabled them to continue in our tradition, even when they fell out of favor among others. But do we have proof? No. Aaron, you have your hand up.
Yes, Rabbi. Does the Mishnah use the Greco word? I thought I saw that in Rabbi Kolb's note.
So Rabbi Kolb talks about it, but the Mishnah does not, but the Gemara does refer to the Greek word. But it's not explicitly stated as being, and this is why we call it this. But the Gemara does use it, and it is found in other texts from that time period. All right. So with all of that in mind, and yeah, that was a 15, 20-minute intro. Let's get down to how the rabbis view netilat yadayim. And we'll, as we go through, we'll also talk about the way they describe it as being where there's open interpretation, some of the different varieties of this custom in the Sephardic and Ashkenazic worlds, and what the common practices are of halakha l'maaseh for now. But I want you to look at this as not just being, how do I wash my hands before I do motzi on Friday night? That we cover that, but I want you to also look at this as being part of the amazing creativity and spiritual just blessing that the rabbis gave us as they made sure this practice would exist and be transmitted to our present day. So we'll talk practical, we'll talk history, we're going to talk spirit. There's so much going on in Yadayim. And it's a short Masechet, so if you're not 100% happy with it, don't worry, we'll be done with it soon.
And you promised me that by the third time, you will accept my suggestion?
Yeah, well, when we finish Yadayim, we'll do Beitzah as the next one.
Okay, because that was the third time.
I know. It's just every now and then, not every now and then. So far, there were other things that I was reviewing that I went, you know what? Hold on, let this first. We'll do Beitzah next. Then, we should, depending upon the speed with which we get through Masechet Yadayim, we should be doing Beitzah sometime either in the just after probably the Chagim. So it'll be a nice reminder of the Chagim. All right. Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. Give me 1 second.
Rabbi, a quick off note is I know she called him Rabbi Kolb, but these Safari calls him Dr. Kolb. He is a rabbi, right?
So I've been trying to look into this because I realized that as well. When I first was exposed to his commentary back in rabbinic school, the professor that introduced him as Rabbi Dr. Joshua Kolb. And many rabbis also have PhDs, and that's perfectly normal. But I noticed that Sefaria only calls him Dr. Kolb. I don't know if that is part of their accommodation. The fact that they have the English explanation from a conservative source on a site that is used also by Orthodox rabbis, I don't know if that is their attempt to keep all of the audience happy. But I haven't been able to track down whether he is an ordained rabbi or whether he is just a PhD. No offense to PhDs out there, but that is also on my back burner of trying to track down his credentials.
I think, if I remember correctly, he teaches JTS, correct?
Yeah, he actually is in the conservative yeshiva, was his baby.
Yes.
He was one of the founders of the conservative yeshiva.
Because I think I took one or two classes from him about Pesach and other things. And he's a PhD, he's not a rabbi.
All right, so until we hear otherwise, we'll give him the honorific of doctor from somebody who has studied with him. But I'll double check that as we go forward. All right, so Mishnah 1 from chapter 1. What we need to know, as Dr. Kulp points out in his introduction here, is that this measurement that we're going to be talking about, a revi'it, is a quarter of a log. A log is the main measure of liquid in Jewish law, and a log is about half a liter. So a revi'it, a quarter of a log, works out to be about 100 grams of water. Very, very little water. As he points it, it's like a third of a can of a Coke. So maybe 4 ounces of water, which is what I was taught as being the imperial measurement of a revi'it, is about 4 ounces. So we've got 4 ounces, and that's going to be something we have to keep in our mind. A minimum of a quarter of a log of water, a revi'it of water, must be poured over the hands for 1 person and even for 2. All right away, let's get controversial. We have a quarter log. We have this this 4 ounces of water, and I apologize, I'm going to use the imperial because it's what I'm used to. And that's how much water we have available.
Sorry, Rabbi, a log is half liter, correct?
Correct. A log is half a liter. A revi'it is a quarter of a log, so it would be 1/8 of a liter.
Okay.
Which works out to be about, as he put it, 100 grams, which doesn't make much sense to me because grams and liters aren't quite the same thing. But I'm much happier with a third of a Coke can, which is about 4 ounces.
What is a can? Sorry.
It's about a third of a can of Coke. So if you had a can of Coke, you could actually do 3 different washings. But wait, says the Mishnah, you can do more than that. If you have that 4 ounces, but you've got 2 people who need to do netilat yadayim, the 4 ounces can be for both of them. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute. If I pour even 1 ounce on one person, then there's not going to be 4 ounces for both of them. One's going to get 1 ounce, one would get 3 ounces. There's not enough. So that seems like it's inadequate. How can the Mishnah be telling me that a revi'it has to be the minimum measure for 1 person, but that a revi'it could also cover 2 people? It should be 8. I mean, sorry, not 8. It should be not a quarter. We should need a half of a log for 2 people. It should be 1/4 or 4 ounces times the number of people. 8 ounces is where my brain was going before. Yes, Natan.
Maybe because they wash at the same time, so one have the hands up and one down. So when you wash one hand, the water falls from your hand to the hand of the second person. So you can use the same amount of water.
It's a creative solution, but not one that's needed, because they don't say that you have to actually do that. They don't say if you stack your hands. They just say it's enough, that quarter is enough for 2 people. And as we're going to see in the next part, a minimum of half a log must be poured over the hands for 3 or 4 people. Again, this is insufficient if we actually needed 4 ounces per person. And if you're still not convinced, paragraph 4 here, a minimum of 1 log is sufficient for 5, 10, or 100 people? How could there be from half a liter enough water to pour over 100 people? Now, Rabbi Yossi does disagree, and we're going to come back and unpack this in just a second. Rabbi Yossi says, as long as there is not less than a quarter of log for the last person among them. So he says, as long as there is that rivi'it at the end, then I guess we can sort of call it okay. That he does sort of still work off this idea that the finale needs to have at least as much as the minimum. But he is outvoted, and he does not carry the day. Technically, you can wash 100 people, 100 people's hands with half a liter of water. And that should tell you right off the bat, let's get this all there, right off the bat that we are dealing here with a symbolic act. We are not dealing here with a mechanical act. A mikvah, for example, is a very strict measurement. Someday maybe we'll study it, but a mikvah has to be 40 seahs of water. It's a particular amount of water. It has to be made in a very particular way. And you can't say that a mikvah is kosher if there isn't enough water left after the first 100 people. If 100 people get into the mikvah and splash it, and now it's only half as much in there, the last person who goes in is not going into a kosher mikvah anymore. But when it comes for netilat yadayim, technically it can. Now, again, I told you I'll tell you halacha lamasi as we go along, but this is one of those places. Nowadays, you will find that people will regularly refill the cup that's used for the washing in order to make sure that there is plenty for the people after. And almost nobody settles for only 4 ounces when washing their hands. Again, third of a Coke can is going to be out of the cup in an instant. And most people will look for having much more than that. But by looking at what we see here in the Mishnah, we can recognize that the rabbis are not talking about the functional quantity needed. They are talking about the minimum needed for the appearance of the ritual to be appropriate. They are not doing this because this is the amount needed. They are doing this because this is the amount needed to feel correct. And that is a huge understanding, hopefully for everybody here, shift that when the rabbis are enacting certain protections, cautions, or instructions and rituals, they are doing so in a way that is meant to ensure that it works, but are not going to do it in a way that undermines the community's capability of doing it. There is a very real problem of if you require more than this amount, then those who are careful will not be able to eat. That you would be putting a barrier in front of people between eating and not eating. And you would be putting a barrier in front of people for whom that if they had to exert much more effort, would simply abandon the ritual altogether. So instead, the rabbis are making it so that this water only has to be a minimum measure, even if it is shared by multiple people. Just the cup itself needs to have the right amount in it when you begin for roughly the number of people that are coming, and that is sufficient. And then if their hands get wet, and everything is fine. Obviously, if you do run out because somebody was selfish in the middle and poured too much, then yes, you're going to need to refill the cup in their view. But that's not the case they're talking about. They're talking about the ideal. All right, questions or comments about that? Hopefully you do appreciate the radical nature of this. There's going to be, I imagine, a lot that seems a little surprising as we go through Yadayim. It's one of the reasons I picked it. Yes, Aaron.
Just out of curiosity, was this something that was implemented after the fall of the temple when purity wasn't a big issue anymore? Is that why it's so little? Because it seems like they you'd have to get water over most your hands, or at least through the fingertips, for it to become pure.
Well, yes-ish. So from what we can tell historically, this was enacted prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, but it was not universally acknowledged or accepted prior to that time. As Dr. Culp pointed out in his introduction, we can even see references to this practice in the Christian Bible, where some of the Pharisees, who were a different splinter group in that time period, argued about the hand washing as well. This was a culture war, if you want to use the modern terminology of the Second Temple period. There were people who thought you should do more, like the Qumran cult. There were people who thought you should do less. There were people who thought you should do A or B of different amounts. And the rabbis are, of course, the opinion that survived, the opinion that lasted, the one that became the permanent accepted variety. Now, why did it last? When the Qumran cult was throwing people into the mikveh multiple times a day, why did our version last? Well, because you don't want to throw people into the mikveh multiple times a day. And why did ours last compared to people who wanted to do nothing? Well, because doing nothing has very little binding power upon a people or community. It doesn't allow them to experience, to grow, and have that connection to both their past and their present. So the rabbis seem to have worked out the right measure. Now, we're going to talk about the quantity that needs to go over different parts of the body, and that will become important in just a little bit. And also, I'll take a break at that time to talk about the modern debate over that part as well. Yes, Aaron.
Oh, and Rabbi,
oh, your connection?
When we go by the generally acknowledged, can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
When we talk about the culture wars, we generally go with the Pharisees as the predecessors to the rabbis, right?
It's always debated because the rabbis themselves criticized the Pharisees in their writings. So the rabbis did not think of themselves as being the Pharisees, much to the chagrin of many of the people that try to put us in the same camp, for those that would like to attack us according to the words of the Christian Bible. However, the rabbis definitely had things in common with the Pharisaic tradition. The Pharisees and the rabbis both believed in an oral Torah. They both believed in a life after death. They both believed in individual piety and practice. What seems to be, in my humble opinion, from what I have read and been taught, a good way to differentiate it is that the rabbis and the Pharisees were of similar mindset when it came to our tradition, but the Pharisees were very different when it came to the way they applied that socially. That the Pharisees, according to the rabbis, were very much about the showing off of their piety, about bragging about their piety. Look at me, look at how pure I am, look at how pious I am, look at, call me a sage, call me a tzaddik, call me Rav. That seems to have been a social trait among the Pharisaic group. And it could, in fact, be, again, not 100% sure on the history here, that the Pharisees were not so much those who believed in the oral tradition, but those who staked out a position about that in a way that was focused on self-aggrandizement. They may have been more of a type of person rather than a political party. But we don't know for sure because the rabbis and other historians from that time period, like Josephus, didn't write about them in that manner, in the manner of a modern anthropologist or sociologist or political scientist. So it's very hard for us to project backwards exactly what category they would be looking back. But yes, there are similarities between Pharisaic beliefs and rabbinic beliefs, but we should not think of them as being the same thing or even as being an evolution of one to the other. They were probably concurrent, and the rabbis, there were probably Pharisees that were from among the rabbinic tradition, and Pharisee was their style of living. That wasn't always laudable. That wasn't always the best way of doing it.
Well, Rabbi, one of the things I couldn't figure out, though, is the Pharisees, from what I can understand, is a group of Jewish people. My understanding is the rabbis were leaders among the Jewish people. So I couldn't figure out who were the rabbis leading, if not the Pharisees.
Well, the rabbis were, again, depending upon different times in our history when we had more or less rabbinic leadership, depending upon the executive branch, to put it bluntly. The Pharisees would have been a style of rabbinic Judaism or Judaism in general, but other Jews that were not Pharisaic in temperament would have still listened to the overall teachings of the rabbis. There were definitely Jews who listened when the rabbis talked about Netilat Yadayim or about other topics that would not have been called Pharisees because socially they didn't act like Pharisees. So the rabbis would have had a much broader leadership role, and they would have had more influence over many groups other than just those that we would now call the Pharisaic style of Judaism.
And Rabbi,
but you're right, it is confusing because the records that we have doesn't give us enough information to really apply modern categories to these groups.
And Rabbi, the time period I was referring to was that of Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai.
Zakkai, yes.
Yeah, I know later on, obviously, they get different followers besides Pharisees, but in the beginning, like Rabbi ben Zakkai, it would have been still, he would have had more than just the Pharisees following him.
Well, actually, by the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Pharisees were pretty much extinct. By that point, almost every other group of Judaism had fallen in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple. So those people go ahead.
I think I meant to say Rabbi Yoha ben Zadok.
I'm
Student of Hillel.
Okay, sorry. Yes, that's much earlier then. So, but again, it's like trying to ask, who does the trying to come up with something that isn't going to be too politically explosive. Let's forget current occupants of any particular political office. If you were to ask who looks to the president for leadership in our country, again, regardless of who might be occupying the office, you can't say, well, only the party that voted for them, or only the party that is famously attached to them. There are many people that would look to the president for leadership and ask, what are you going to be doing about this international issue or this economic issue or this domestic issue, even if they voted against them. But they would still expect an answer to come from the occupant of that place in our society. And the rabbis occupied a place of teaching and of guidance that even people that didn't always listen to them would have still looked to them. Even people who didn't identify explicitly as being rabbinic Jews or Pharisaic Jews or whatever would have still welcomed their insight on many different actions. Would they have followed it 100%? Well, no. And I can tell you without fear of contradiction that in the modern world, there is no Jew who belongs to any synagogue that follows any teaching of their particular rabbi occupying their synagogue's pulpit 100%. I would be absolutely staggered to find anyone. And that is simply a matter of the fact that there is usually going to be either room for disagreement, valid disagreement, or people will ignore the things they don't like, even if by ignoring it, they are violating what they should not be violating. And that is true for the rabbinic time period as well. There are people who should have listened to the rabbis who ignored them. There are people who mostly listened to the rabbis, but ignored some of what they said. There are people who tried to do everything the rabbis said, but weren't great at it. And there were the rabbis themselves who disagreed with each other and didn't always do what the other rabbi said. So there was a much more diverse community than perhaps the shorthand descriptions make it appear. And that's, again, one of the things that I like about Mishnah Yadayim is it shows us a much more complicated and an interesting community. It's not just the rabbis made rules and everyone did. The rabbis are going out of their way to convince people. And you only convince when you recognize that you lack the authority to enforce 100% compliance. Now, lacking the ability to enforce 100% compliance can be partly that you lack administrative levers. You can't throw people in jail or flog them as much as you'd like. But it can also be that you recognize that the people are still getting their willingness to listen to these opinions rather than just doing what they want, and that you do need the power of persuasion because there will be no way to properly police everyone, especially in this kind of issue, in their homes.
Rabbi, the only reason I was going to say I thought the political one wasn't on point is because a lot of the presidents who are over people who are not of their party are ruling over them not by their choice. With the rabbis, everybody who followed the rabbis did so by choice. So they would have had more in common.
No. Sorry, that's a misconception. At different times of our history, the rabbinic courts had full legal authority, life and death, capital crimes, down to establishing rules of kashrut that would affect what could or couldn't be sold in the marketplace.
Right. No, I meant to say in the beginning, though. My understanding in the beginning that they were following the rabbis by choice.
So that's a much longer conversation of, was rabbinic Judaism always part of Judaism? And the very short version that I believe is quite compelling is that while we didn't have people with the title named rabbi, we did have the learned Kohanim and Levi'im that acted as judges and teachers. And we had the Sofrim, Ezra being the key example, that acted again as teachers of the tradition and transmitters of the tradition, and also acted as judges, even though they were neither Kohanim nor Levi'im. And that was always a part of our people. We can see this also reflected in the book of Judges. But at the same time that we had that in structure, they had more or less authority depending upon other factors of our society or who was invading us at any given time. So we can't say that the rabbis always had 100% authority, and we can't say that the rabbis were invented later on. Just because the term rabbi only became common later on doesn't mean that the basic apparatus didn't pre-exist that term. All right, that's all we're going to say about that topic, because otherwise we're not even going to get past the first Mishnah tonight. Because we haven't even gotten to the last part of the first Mishnah, which is more water may be added to the second water, but more may not be added to the first water. All right, first and second water, what we are talking about here is the fact that when we do netilat yadayim, we pour water over the hand, and then we do it again. That's our first and second water. And yes, halacha l'maaseh, well, I should minhag l'maaseh, the current custom for many people is to do this at least 3 times, but the minimum is 2. And that's why we're talking about first and second. Why? Well, when we pour the first water on our hands, we actually create a condition where there is susceptibility for ritual impurity and now a means of transmission, meaning the water that touches our hand first, which our hand is impure, that water now becomes a contaminant. We've talked before that when you add moisture to produce, then that produce can now gain ritual impurity. Prior to that, it's in its natural state, and in its natural state, impurity isn't an issue. If we put water on our hand and then touch something, if our hand is impure, then the water is impure, and now that we've moistened it, it is now impure. We've completely defeated the purpose of trying to wash our hands. Therefore, the second washing removes the water of the first washing, and that leaves only a state of purity in its wake. All right, so that's the basic structure of netilat yadayim. That's why we wash 2 times. We're going to talk how much the hand has to be washed when we get to chapter 2. But right now, the question is, what happens if I don't pour enough on the first washing to cover all of the part of the hand that needs to get wet? Can I add more, or would that be wrong? Now, adding more would be considered adding to the second water, because our first splash creates that ritual impurity. The second splash removes it to leave only purity. And the answer is you cannot add from that first wash. If you don't hit all of the part of the hand that needs to be washed with the first flow of water, that first effluence of the flow, then you have to dry the hand and start all over again. Because if you don't, that second water is going to hit the part that wasn't moistened on the first run, and that second water is now going to become ritually impure. It's going to mingle with whatever's left on the rest of the hand, and you're just spreading the impurity around. It's like, trying to wash your dog, but you only wash his legs, and then you wash his thighs. Well, washing his thighs is just going to pour back into the legs, and then washing the back will pour to the thighs. That's you have to get all of the dirt ready in the first flow, and then it removes at the second flow. So if you miss the first flow, you gotta dry it up and get ready to do it again. And like I said, not tonight. In chapter 2, we're going to talk about how much of the body or the hand needs to be washed for netilat yadayim to be at all. But for the moment, just imagine handness, and we'll come back to the technical size later on. Aaron.
Yes, Robert. Is the reason you wash twice is because at most the hands are at a first level of purity, so then the water takes on a second level of purity when the first time you wash it?
Nope.
And then
nope, that's not how that's just like you don't have to go in the mikvah multiple times depending upon your impurity level. It's not like each dunk removes a little impurity. The issue here is that when you put water on the hands, the water is now contaminated by the impurity of the hands and thus needs to be removed before it comes into contact with food, which would then obviously render the food ritually impure, being both impure and wet.
But
yes.
No, what I couldn't figure out is how come the water, when you add more water, the water that's already on your hand doesn't contaminate the new water? And the only thing I could think of would be if it's at a second level of impurity, then it cannot impure anything else.
So rewind the video 20 minutes. And when I said this is not about the actual mechanics, I meant it. That is the part that, Rabbi Neely's trying to blow your mind, that this section of the Mishnah and this particular ritual activity of netilat yadayim cannot be reduced to the mechanics of removing the ritual impurity correctly. We can't remove the ritual impurity of our body by washing one part of it. That isn't how Torah does ritual impurity. So the fact that we're doing this at all doesn't mechanically make sense. We cannot remove ritual impurity by having only 3 ounces or 4 ounces of water that could cover 100 people. Well, sorry, half a liter for covering 100 people. That doesn't make sense physically for how much water would be on the person. The idea here of, well, wouldn't the second water be contaminated by the first water is absolutely right. That would be a problem. And then you would be locked in a loop of reduction that is going to end up with you having to immerse entirely in the mikveh in order to be ritually pure. But the rabbis don't want to go down that road. They don't want to end up like the Qumran cult, where they are jumping in the mikveh every time they eat. So this is a lesson in establishing a ritual that is important, but building in a moderation to prevent it from either becoming too onerous or too ignored by people who refuse to do that level of difficulty. So if you try to break it down into the mechanics, you are missing the point of why the rabbis did this, and you're going to be very disappointed because the mechanics don't work. Physically, this is not enough water. Physically, you can't do only part of the body. It's just not the way it works. The rabbis are trying to accomplish something here other than just making you clean. If they wanted you to just be clean, they would have told you to wash your hands while doing the alphabet 2 times and use, antibacterial soap. And that's not what they're doing.
But Rabbi, just out of curiosity, at a mechanical level, if the hands are first level impurity and the water takes on second level of impurity, then you pour again, it can't contaminate it again, though, because second level impurities can't spread contamination, right?
But the first washing did not remove the actual impurity. Again, I cannot say that strongly enough. Pouring water over your hands does not, according to the Torah, actually remove any impurity. If you were a Kohen back in the time of the temple, and you had just come from a funeral that you had to go to, and someone offered you truma, washing your hands would not be sufficient to eat the truma. You would have to go to a mikveh first before you could actually eat it, because washing just part of the body does not create a cleansing from actual Torah impurity. The rabbis have, I said it before, but I didn't say it loud enough, invented this issue. they invented the idea of having an impurity of the hands that was separate from the impurity of the body. And thus it doesn't play by the same rules as the impurity of the body. And they did this, like I talked about in the introduction, for good reasons. First, for precautions to the Kohanim, and then for precautions and a lesson to the rest of us. But that means we don't have to play by the Torah's rules of impurity. We have to play by the rabbi's rules. Natan, I think I saw you try to.
Yeah, two questions. The first one, here say that you pour in twice, but we don't pour 3 times water for each country.
So I mentioned, I think you might have been off camera for that moment.
Yeah.
So the halacha lama'aseh is still just pouring twice. The common minhag is to pour 3 or more times. So you will find most people will probably pour 3 times or maybe even more. Just like you'll find most people use far more water than a Rivi'it for doing their hand washing. But if we're actually talking halacha from the rabbis of precisely following their instructions, technically that 4 ounces and 1 and 2 washing would be sufficient.
And what happens if you, like really, someone wash the hand with soap before? Like how much you need to do after that for the cleanliness, the ritual cleanliness?
You need to do everything. If
also the same 2, 3, like the rabbi.
Exactly. If you are a doctor and you wash your hands like you're doing surgery, and then you say, oh, wait, I don't want to do an operation. I want to have some bread. You have to go, even with your hands, with all of the gloves and everything, you take off the gloves and you get the netilat cup and you wash them without soap, and then you do your motzi. There is nothing about this that is actually changing the physical cleanliness of the hands. That this is not about bacteria. Now, is there a side benefit that in the millennia before the bacterial theory got going and germ theory got going, that washing our hands even a little was better than nothing? Of course, absolutely. And I don't think we should be surprised that,
the Black Pest, that's why the Jews were less affected than the Christians in Europe, because they wash their hands.
So interestingly enough, the actual numbers don't quite bear that out. That the Jews were not much less spared, that the actual rate of death in most communities was almost the same between Jew and non-Jew from the Black Death. I know people say that the reason that the non-Jews attacked us was because we weren't dying at the same rate as they were. But the fact is they killed us because they were evil and they were afraid that we were dying and we were losing so many people from our communities from the Black Death, and they didn't care. What they cared about was blaming someone for this. And we were a very convenient target. They didn't care that we were also burying our dead just about as much as theirs. The records from the census and the death rolls in the communities where you had Jews and non-Jews together show that the percentage of Jewish population was going down about the same. Maybe a few more people lived, which is always a blessing and important, but the Black Death was not the same as COVID. The Black Death was killing you regardless of how much you washed your hands or even took a bath.
Rabbi.
Yes.
What's the point of this rabbinic leniency, if you want to call it a leniency?
Well, the point of the leniency is to maintain the stringency. And that's something we also talked about when we did Masechet Eruvin.
Right, but now
it's a giant leniency in and of itself. The reason the rabbis are being lenient with the ritual they established is so that the ritual they established will continue to be observed.
Right, but what's the point of having clean hands when you're still unclean?
Because you're actually thinking about ritual purity. Just think about the difference between a person who thinks there is a state of ritual purity, and I'm going to do this action, which, while technically isn't actually changing my state, is reminding me of ritual purity. And the other person who says, I'm ritually impure, I always will be, my grandfather was, my grandchildren will be, I don't need to talk about this, I don't need to think about this. You know, when Mashiach comes, then we'll deal with it. You would be taking a large piece of Jewish life, well, a whole sixth of the Mishnah, one of the entire orders of the Mishnah, and just throwing it out the window. It would never even be brought to mind. And yes, this isn't functionally changing our ritual status, except vis-a-vis the rabbinic idea that your hands are made ritually impure in this special way. But you would be losing, if you didn't think of this, you'd be losing that entire pillar of Jewish thought. And the rabbis did not want that to happen. They wanted people to still have a concept of tahor and tameh, of something that is pure and something that is impure in a ritual way.
But the girls are still going to the mikveh every month.
Yes, absolutely. And likewise, maybe we'll do nida sometime. That is also, pardon the expression, pointless as far as ritual purity goes. It is absolutely important, don't get me wrong, and don't quote me out of context. It is absolutely important for the maintaining of the concept of taharat mishpacha, of family purity, and the separation, of course, of husband and wife during those time, during the period of the month, and not having intimacy, and by reinaugurating intimacy through the mikveh. That is very important. But if you're asking me if I had a little meter that measured whether somebody was ritually pure or not, and it was somebody who just came out of the mikveh, the moment they set foot out of the mikveh, they are exactly as ritually impure as they were before they went in. That's just the function of the modern world. But we don't give up the activity just because we are going to revert instantaneously. And I don't think we're going to get much further tonight. So let me just say this, because I think it's a beautiful aspect of Judaism, that we don't just give up on our traditions and our teachings just because we can't make it real. There is an obsession in the modern world with, if I can't actually do it, then I don't want to think about it, talk about it, learn about it, or do anything that's connected to it. And Judaism said, we cannot offer sacrifices. We're going to study them anyway. We cannot go to Jerusalem. For much of our history, it was off limits, but we are going to think about it and pray in that direction anyway. I cannot be ritually pure, but I'm going to learn about it, and I'm going to follow all of the activities, even though the moment I leave the mikveh, I am back to where I started. That is not crazy. That is a beautiful connection to something that we dream of, that we hope will be part of the world around us in a tangible way. And we keep that dream alive by returning to it over and over again.
It's not to create a virtual world.
To create what?
A virtual world.
A virtual world. I mean, it's a nice way of looking at it, yes. That we create an overlay, a layer on this world. And where other people see ruins, we see Jerusalem rebuilt. And we work to bring those two things together so that the virtual, the dream, becomes the reality. And if you leave off the virtual, if you leave off that dream, then you give up. You no longer learn, you no longer are inspired by these aspects of our tradition and faith. And I believe that this, as much as any part of rabbinic Judaism, not just the hand washing literally, but this idea that we are going to hold on to the idea of these aspects of Judaism, even when we can't do them, that we're going to study them and teach them, and we're going to create reminders of them that are part of our life, even if it's not really doing anything, because it is doing something spiritually, and it is doing something practically in the long term, because it keeps us alive, it keeps us fighting and inspired. And we can see in our lives, more than any others recently, just how much Judaism has achieved in 100 years, because we still had those dreams, because we still lived with this as our vision of the world. So yes, it doesn't really do anything actually practically, and yet it also has changed the world. So I consider that to be a win, even if the actual measure of impurity didn't change. And with that in mind, we will tackle the second Mishnah next week. And I'm sure we'll get into a more regular groove once we get some of these big ideas, talked about. And they are big and important. And again, that's one of the reasons I brought it. And we're going to talk about some even bigger ideas. Well, is it bigger than what I just said? We're going to talk about some other very big ideas as we go through the Masechet as well. And we'll talk more about the practicality of doing Netilat Yadayim in your own life. We will keep touching back into the modern world of how do we actually do this nowadays. So it's practical, it is historical, it is spiritual. Hopefully you agree with me, Mishnah Yadayim is going to be an interesting few chapters. All right, everybody, take care, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you for the show.